Hi kids, welcome to Stylus Rumble Breaking Time thing. It's been a whole week since I've been around. I had a crazy week. Everything piled up at the same time. I had to fly to Newfoundland because I had some family stuff that came up. So I haven't been around. And I appreciate your patience, but now we're finally going to get to talk about some of this constraint stuff. I've got a few announcements coming up. I did an interview with the Toonboom blog, which came out yesterday, so I'll link that down below. I've probably posted it on Twitter and stuff already. You can check that out. I've got some more stuff coming up that I don't have any information on yet, but stay tuned. There's gonna be some exciting stuff. I don't think I'm gonna be doing live streams on Mondays because it was kind of like I was already overextended. Instead, what I think I'll do is if you guys have questions, do a Q&A regularly because it's a little bit easier for me to work off a not schedule so that I can do things in the morning or evenings or be a little bit more flexible. If things change schedule wise, I might do some more live streams, but they're not going to be scheduled every week. It's not sustainable with the amount of work that I have right now. It's so fun. I really want to do it. It's just I also need to sleep and I like doing 2 videos a week. Either I'd have to do a live stream and 1 video a week, or I could do 2 videos a week. I think I can't keep doing both at this pace. Okay, so send in your questions about any of the stuff, the 15 stuff or the older stuff, anything you guys have questions on, and I'll do Q&As regularly on YouTube. Also next week, as long as everybody's schedule holds up, I'm going to have a rigging roundtable on Sunday. So I've got 3 super pro riggers who I'm going to talk to about the new program and rigging in a work environment, stuff like that, how you get into rigging, some baby rigger advice, things of that nature. So hopefully you guys pop by Sunday and everything works out and that gets done. If not, I'll have some other stuff on Sunday for sure. So here I am. I'm working behind the scenes here and I'm setting up the 2-point constraint. I did talk about this a lot in my previous video, but I want to go over it so that all the constraint stuff is in one place so you guys don't have to jump back and forth between these two. So let me just unplug these pegs. The 2-point constraint you pull in like this. It's got a big intimidating window, which we'll talk about. And then it has 3 ports here. The first port, boop, boop, you select it and it belongs to the switch. So that's talking about this constraint switch, which we're going to go over. And then these 2, left peg, right peg. That you can just grab a couple pegs. They're just regular old pegs and just plug them in there. And all these new modules are really dependent on using a peg pivot. So just like you normally find it, your pegs pivot down here. That's set up with either the rotate tool. Any of these specialized tools will allow you to set it up. But the rotate tool I like because it gives you a circle. So if you do need to set up something around a circular thing, it gives you a little bit of a guide. But you want to try and get it right on the edge of this guy here so that you have the most control over what you're doing. And then this one you can go on the bottom edge. If you need it to pivot around a certain point, just based on your design, then set up your pivot in a logical position. But as simple as that, we're able to start using this constraint. All it is just 2 pegs. That's the 2 points, and it's being constrained. I'm just going to set up a quick deformer just so we can compare the difference between the 2 of them, because I think a lot of people are going to lean more towards the deformer when they first think about it, just because, you know, it's old hat. You're kind of used to it now. But as you can see, when you stretch this, it's actually getting some stretch. Whereas with the deformer, if you wanted some logical squash and stretch, you'd have to make it, you'd have to shrink it down like this to get the same thing. You're also, the roundness is staying more similar. Here we're getting more of a pointed end. So, and then of course the deformer is going to be able to do these things. And this texture is holding up. I figured I'd get a little bit more fracturing, but this one of course is not going to be able to do that. So this one, the deformer is going to have some places where it's doing its thing really well. And the 2-point constraint is going to have places where it's doing its thing really well. And the biggest advantage here is that squash and stretch. So let's open up our box here because this is the real meat of it. The active, if I turn this down, this is going to tell it a percentage. So it's saying right now this is about 50% of the movement. So you're going to get about half as much distance when you move it like that. And you can turn it off completely. So you can set this to 0 and that turns off the constraints and you can turn them on again. Volume modifier, this is telling it how much it can affect the volume of things. So if we turn this up a lot, it's gotten quite skinny. Turn it down, boop. And it's not affecting it as much. So you can see it's maintaining its width pretty well at 58. If I put it at 0, then you're going to get what we got with the deformer, but you still get the ends are a little bit pointy. Shouldn't have deleted that so you could still see. At 100, you're getting quite a bit. So you're probably going to want something in between here. I think they had that set to it's 50 or 25. You can just play around with it and see what suits your fancy in terms of squashing there. Volume max, this is another one that affects the volume. So if I put this at 100, you're going to see that when we squish it down like this, it's maintaining its width pretty well. It was set to 200, and you get a lot more width that way, but it stops about there. And then you can keep turning it up, so now you're going to get much more outward stretch at 300, at 400, it gets a little bit more. And then volume modifier, if we turn that up, it's giving you a little bit more. So between these two, the volume modifier and the volume max, you can affect how much it's going to stretch out or how scrawny it's going to get when you pull it up like this. So it's a fun little thing to have control over. Then volume minimum, if you put this down to 0, you're going to be able to flatten it out into a plane, basically, to like super duper thin. That just keeps it from turning into a little invisible twig. Boop. Volume max, so if we set this at 5, then it's not going to stretch any farther than 5. 14, you get a little bit more. If it's set to 0, then it's just off. And I think I wouldn't affect the volume max and minimum. Personally, I'd rather just have the control over it. But there might be places where if stuff is frequently going off model when people are using this, that you'd want to constrain them a little bit. So I think this is more like a constrain your animators because they're cray rather than something I would use. The skew modifier is great. So right now it's set to 0, so it's not skewing at all. We set it up to 100. Then we're getting a lot more skew on this guy. So if I flip over like this, we're going to get an actual flip, and it's acting a little bit more flat. If we put this down to 0 again, that's when we're getting this rotate thing. So I think if you were using this to anchor a rope to a place, then you'd want to have it at 0 so that it could move around. But as I was talking about in my other video, if you were doing a little character out of this guy, then you can set it at 0, and then he's kind of sitting on the ground plane. So a bouncing ball or something, you probably won't want all that rotation. That's a good one to know. The smoothing, it's something that you have to see when it's actually animated. So the way I've read it is when you stretch it up like this, it tapers the end of the stretch. So you can see if you're watching when it stops stretching. So just look at the width of the ball. So it's skinny, 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 and then stop stretching. So smoothing, what I gather, when you turn this up, it tapers how quickly that end happens. I feel like that's very situational, but if that's something you're noticing when you're animating, that it seems like it's suddenly stopped, like it's slamming into a skinny and then straightening out, then you'd want to play with the smoothing there to kind of taper that. The point balance, it has to do with which of these are the boss ones. So right now, it says that the right port, this guy here is the primary port, and that has to do with doing z-axis stuff. Just like when you're setting up something like a bitmap composite, you're saying that the leftmost is going to control the z-axis. Well, here the primary port is this one. So when it's looking for z information, it's going to talk to this one. So it works together. These three things work together. You can tell it left, topmost, bottommost. This one's the z guy. I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this. So currently, I can only translate this point. I can't rotate it or skew it. It's not really having any impact, but you can play with this stuff and so that it includes the transform. And I'll just haul over. I have this available so that I can double check my information to make sure that I'm not lying to you guys. So the transform type, this is allowing it or not allowing it to use the other translations. So right now, up, down, left, right is telling the peg to move around, and it ignores the transformation done on the primary peg, only applies the transformation required for the elements to track the 2 points. So that's just saying if this skews or rotates or does anything, just ignore it. And I think that's 99% of the time the way that you're going to use it, just because like getting down into these other ones seem like more complex than helpful at this point. I mean, I could change my mind later when I figure it out a little better. So transform, and let's just peek back over here. So I've switched this down to transform here in the transform type. This applies transformation calculated by the 2 points constraint node to make the element track the 2 points, then applies the scale, angle, skew values of the primary peg on top of them. So this is saying that when you move these things around, this happens first. So I'm going to move this, and then I'm going to move that, and then the scale is happening. So you can see now I have this scalability. Before, if this is at translate, if I scale this, nothing happens. I set this to transform. Now this peg here, this one you can still not affect, but this one, because it's in this port, you can transform that now and skew that now. and it happens after this. So this happens first, over happens first, now squish happens next. So it's just telling the order of operations. Now this one here, local transform, applies the scale, angle, and skew values of the primary peg on the element, then applies transform calculations by the 2-point nodes for the element to track the 2 points. So that one, the local transform, says first squish happens, then move happens. So I can move it around, but the squish happens first. Rotate happens first, then the peg movement. So that's the difference between transform. Transform means that the move uppy, downy, lefty, righty happens first. Then squish, rotate, skew happen. Local transform means squish, rotate, skew happen first, then the shifty movie bits happen after. So this is pretty specific situational stuff, but I feel like it's easier to add more pegs. Pegs are so cheap, they're really light. I don't know, maybe there's a reason that people would want to do it this way. I don't know. So let's talk about the flatten type a little bit. Let's just read it right out of here. So this parameter defines what happens if one of the pegs defining the constraint points is moved on the z-axis. So all this flatten stuff is just like using your bitmap composite versus your pass-through composite. It's just giving it information on how it's going to use the z-axis, where it's going to find it. Ignore 3D transformations. This element will be constrained to the vertical horizontal axis of the pegs and will ignore their positions on the z-axis. So what that means is if we were going into our perspective mode and we're going to grab this guy and move it back, we're going to enable our 3D here. If we move this back, it's just going to say like, that didn't happen. It's just going to totally ignore it by setting this to ignore 3D transform. We set it to allow 3D transform, then you can see that we can actually just lay our guy back in perspective. Whoop. This is the default, and you're able to move this point anywhere in 3D space. And then when you look in your camera view, it's going to find a logical way to display it. So let's see what it says. Allow 3D transformation. The element will be 3D rotated to follow the position of the pegs in 3D space. That's what we just saw. If we put something in here, we'll pull that back through our guy here. We'll enable 3D on our other point so we can pull it through our guy here. And now in our camera view, you can see that it's acting in a 3D way by allowing it to 3D transform. So you're actually going to see it cut through other things. Project a plane is going to project this thing onto a plane and force it. So if we ignore the 3D transform, it's just going to not lay back in space that way. We allow it, it's going to cut through like that. And we project a plane, it looks a lot like the 3D transform, but what it's actually doing is taking the Z information of this peg here and using that to determine where in space it's projecting that object. So because this guy is the rightmost, and in here, the primary port is the rightmost, if we change that to left, then where the leftmost peg is, that's where it's going to project our plane. It's just constraining its z-axis to one point or the other. And if you ignore 3D transform, it's still going to be using the primary port to determine its z information. So let's see what the difference between the projection is. Loop. So the element will be constrained to 2D, but will be made to follow the perceived position of the points from the camera's point of view. This means the 3D position of the points will be projected on the 2D plane that's parallel to the camera. So I'm sure there's a logical reason to switch between ignore the transform and project a plane, but I think just sticking to the 3D transform here or allowing it is going to be the most logical way to work through those things. And then the primary port here, the primary port, that's what I was talking about. This guy here is in the primary port, so he's going to have all the control over the Z stuff that's happening. All right, so if we did do something like this where it's cutting through and we wanted to, because we're getting that visual perspective on our object here, so it actually looks like it's kind of retreating into space, you could always throw in a bitmap composite and then give it just a little Z controller. So just by throwing a guy in here that's set to whatever Z information you want, that's going to flatten it while maintaining that visual three-dimensional planing. So you can get it look like it's going back in space, but then you can force it using a bitmap composite to be where you want it to be. All right, so that's a little long-winded explanation, but hopefully all of this stuff makes sense. Now you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with this big old box. And then the 3-point constraint and multi-point constraint, that is just an extension of what we have here. So we can just throw 3 points in instead of 2. Grab 3 pegs, doopy doopy doop, and then set them up wherever we want. Just for fun, let's see what happens if we put them in a line. So by hitting up down, I'm just adding a keyframe to all of these, because if I hit Shift F11 now, it's going to give me a little location of where these guys are set up. So just for fun, let's put it in the middle and see how that works out. We'll grab this middle guy. Whoa! So it doesn't seem to want to curve it at all, and it's having trouble stretching it. So let's move this out into a little bit more of a logical orientation. And now we're going to be able to stretch them from those 3 points. So this would work a little bit better with something triangular. And you're going to be able to fake a little bit of perspective and stuff on it. You have fewer options here, but you can still allow things to go back in space and things like that in the transform type. But you don't have all those squash and stretch options that you do in the 2.1, so they get progressively easier to handle these boxes. Then the multi-point constraint. So I'm just going to slam in a whole pile of pegs here. This is 5. I'm not sure if there's an upper limit of how many you can actually put in there, but 5 is going to be good, I think. Set all those up real quick. So this option box is the smallest. It still allows for 3D or projects to plane, but it doesn't have that. It doesn't have ignore 3D transform. So that's a good thing to keep your eye on. But what it has instead is down here, allow perspective transform. So I think it's going to ignore it until you allow it. Let's just have a little look-see. Let's tell this one you're allowed to go back in 3D space. We'll just grab it here and we'll pull it back. If we allow it, let's look at that in our camera view. Boop, boop, boop. So if we don't allow it, then it's kind of staying, it's not giving it the warped, let's turn this guy off. You can see it's warping it back into space by allowing the perspective transform. Boop, boop. Ignore internal points. So that's if you'd taken this guy for some reason and put him right in the middle here. So now it's just going to ignore that one. If you find that the math is mucking it up, I think that's fairly situational. And then if you ignore the points, you can see that weird one that's gone back in space because it's in the middle. It's just ignoring it altogether. So that's all those things mean. And you have these guys, which we're familiar with now, and then you're active on off. So the last thing I'm going to talk about real quick is this switch. So there's no switch. I don't know if it'll still work in here. Let me just see. If we turn this off. Yeah. So all this is this active guy, this switch in here, it's just giving you an external handle for that. So if we had a 3-point constraint and a multi-point constraint, like a whole bunch of different ones, boop, boop, we could have them all plugged in like this. And now we could turn them all on and off. So one thing that my friend Teddy Bear Bones pointed out, if you hit Shift F11, this thing pops up. Beep. So here we have a GUI offset. Apparently that's how it's pronounced. GUI stands for Graphic User Interface. So this, and this guy here, is just a handle for this active thing. So now we could just muck around with it like this. How cool is that? So we can just turn it off and on, and it's going to act as a switch without having to open up these boxes. That's great. Target gate, that has to do with the transformation gate, which we can talk about in another episode, but it's giving it just if you have a bunch of different ones, say you have different views and you have each one set up so that all your stuff's on 1 and all your stuff's on 2 for these gates, then you can have an outside controller for all of those different things without having to open up a ton of boxes, which is super cool. So you have to make those yourself using like scripts and stuff, which was kind of annoying. The GUI offset, so this is just moving this guy around. So if I move this up in the X, it's moving over, it's moving down, and then the GUI scale, that's shrinking it or scaling it. So all of this stuff just has to do with this little handle. And all this constraint switch does is control these two things for a bunch of stuff. And you can use the multi-point constraint with a switch, even though it doesn't have a little box available. You can just sneak it in there. So that's pretty much it for those 3 types of constraints. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident about playing around with them now, because they're super fun, especially the 2-point constraint. I can just think of so many little fun things I can do with that. I totally want to make a little 2-point constraint monster just because, as soon as I get the free time. So Sunday's video hopefully will be the rigger roundtable with a few of my friends who have been rigging in the industry for a few years now. I have lots of information. I'm going to see what their thoughts are on 15, some advice for baby riggers or just animators, what kind of stuff you should keep an eye on and learn if you want to be an animator, how they got into rigging, stuff like that. So stay tuned for that. My next tutorial video is going to be, so I was reading the forum and I know a lot of people are really disappointed at how complex the master controller system is, because I mean, I find it intimidating. I've been doing this for a long time. So what I'm going to do is just show you a low budget workaround for a head controller. Okay, so that's in the next video. I think Wednesday it'll be up. if not a little bit before. I feel a little bit about skipping Sunday's video, but what are you gonna do? Life gets in the way. If you have any questions for the riggers, please leave them down below. If you have any questions on constraints, leave those down below, or anything you want to see specifically talked about with some of the new stuff. Like I said, the master controller is going to be a long time coming from me. I'm going to keep an eye out for all the information I can. I'm talking to some guys who work in the industry behind the scenes, so I'm going to try and mine as much information as I can to start getting that underway, but that's going to be a long time coming. Because I'm not a programmer. I can't write scripts. I don't know how to do that. I'm probably going to have to take a JavaScript for Dummies course soon. I don't know. So that's it. I'm going to go away now. But like, share, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do. Stay tuned for announcements, and I'll see you in the next video.